Inspired by a mystical. The Valis trilogy was 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 inspired by a mystical. Inspired by a. The Valis trilogy was inspired by a. The Valis trilogy was inspired. The Boundless trilogy was inspired by a 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 trilogy was inspired by a mystical